I finished 12 books in January and DNF'd one, so in this video I'm going to review all 13, let you know my thoughts, and give you recommendations for which books I think are maybe a skip and which books I would recommend you pick up. So without further ado, I'm going to go in chronological order, and we'll start with the first book I finished this month, which was Hijab, Butch Blues by Lamia H. This was our book club pick for December, but I decided to wait till January to read it because I knew our discussion was going to be happening early January, and I typically try to leave my book club picks to the last minute, at least the last week before a meeting, so it's as fresh as possible in my mind when we actually do our discussion, because I really like to be super involved in the discussion and be able to share my thoughts and feelings as they're still fresh in my mind and really engage with everything that's being brought up by the other book club members. And Hijab, Butch Blues is a memoir. So Lamia H is a queer Muslim woman who moved from an undetermined country. She's trying to keep her life sort of anonymous, so we don't get all the details, but she moves to the US for college. And once she moves to the States, she experiences racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia and is trying to navigate this huge change in her life, find a queer community to be a part of, but also a Muslim community to be a part of, and trying to figure out how she can be both. And the memoir has a pretty interesting structure where Lamia will start a chapter or a section with a story from the Quran, and then she will sort of tie it in with a part of her life and sort of draw parallels between the stories of the Quran and her own life, and kind of constantly tie these things together as she talks about finding her own identity and trying to find belonging and coming to terms with limitations perhaps of some of her family members, and ultimately coming to the decision to stay in the closet with her family. So this was a really interesting pick. We chose it for our LGBTQI+ rep and author prompt. I did find that it started to feel a bit repetitive as the book went on. It felt at times as though Lamia was trying to shoehorn stories in to fit with a story from the Quran that didn't necessarily have all that in common, but because they had sort of set a precedent of this being the structure of the memoir, they felt like they had to always have a story from the Quran that fit whatever story they were trying to tell from their own life. And it did at times feel a little forced. Sometimes it wasn't quite as obvious what the connection was, or that connection was a little bit more tenuous. I found Lamia's story really interesting, and I was really most excited to hear how Lamia was able to really reconcile these two things. And while it was definitely something that was explored throughout, and it was something that was talked about pretty regularly, it was sort of the central focus, I would say, of the memoir, I did feel like I never really fully understood how she did reconcile that. Lamia is very faithful, and it's interesting. It's a very interesting perspective, but I wanted to understand more of how Lamia was able to maintain that faith despite maybe some contradictions. And again, it's sort of alluded to at times or briefly brought up, but it was never really explored to the level that I expected going into this, especially the way it was blurbed and kind of my understanding of what the purpose of the memoir was. I can see very clearly why it would be so incredibly validating and inspiring and comforting and important for fellow queer Muslims to read a story of someone who has carved their own path, maintained their faith while being accepting of their own sexuality and finding a partner and, having a happy life. I think it's very important that this book exists for that reason, and that it can be that for people who need that community, that need to see that it's possible and to find that acceptance of themselves while still practicing their faith, if that's something that's important to them. Generally, I think this really delivers what Lamia set out to do, especially when it comes to writing specifically to fellow queer Muslims, and for that reason, I thought it was good and gave it 3 stars. The next book I finished in January was a buddy read with a friend of mine. Welcome to the Hyunam-Dong Bookshop by Wang Boram. She had a copy, and it was something that I noticed when I was going through the Goodreads Choice Awards nominees, and it seemed, like a comforting, cozy sort of slice of life read, which can be hit or miss for me, but I felt like I needed something that would calm my nervous system with everything happening in the world. So I suggested we both read it so that we could chat about it the next time we FaceTimed. And unfortunately, this one did not work for me. My friend loved it, so, your mileage may vary. My friend gave it 5 stars. For me personally, it just didn't connect. It didn't work for me. Sometimes when there are these cozy slice of life books, but they feel more like a self-help book or a nonfiction that is masquerading as fiction, that's what it felt like to me. It felt like very trite life lessons, and they were all things that I have learned by existing. Lessons such as focus on what you're doing to do a better job at whatever you're doing. Wow, thanks. Never thought of that. And I do try to be a little bit more understanding of the writing style when it comes to translated fiction, because I really don't know how much of the word choices and the way things were written came from the original author and how much of it was due to the translator. But I just felt like the messages were very basic. I didn't find them particularly inspiring or interesting, to be honest. And maybe I'm too old for this book. Maybe if I read it, although my friend is only a year younger than me, so I don't know. But for her, I think the appeal was that she would love to open a bookshop. And this book does kind of feel like a how-to guide to open and run your own bookshop. Maybe it would have been better as nonfiction for that reason. But for me, reading it, it just felt like there were so many, life lessons about things like, if you work yourself to the ground and get burned out, you won't be happy. You should really find work-life balance, which, thanks. I mean, not all of us have the kind of savings that this protagonist does to quit her high-paying job and open a bookshop and run it however she wants without really considering if it's going to make money or not, because she has enough money saved and can kind of set her own hours and just do whatever she wants. Most of us have to work for a living and can't afford to leave a job that is soul-sucking. And even those of us who do jobs that we love, I think maybe that's part of it too, where I'm reading it from the perspective of someone who has been working for myself, doing what I love for years, and it's awesome in a bunch of ways, but doing what you love and working for yourself does not prevent having issues with work-life balance or having burnout or feeling like you're working yourself into the ground. I have struggled with all of those things, even more so in some ways since working for myself and having a job that I'm passionate about than I did before. So I think for me, not only did it not land necessarily as particularly true to the experience of being an entrepreneur or working for yourself, being your own boss, but it also felt a bit unrealistic and a bit trite and very basic. And I just didn't care about the characters necessarily. That is kind of what gives me that cozy feeling, to feel like I know the characters and I'm happy for them to have this cozy life, and I feel like I can take a break from my own life for a bit and step into theirs. In this book, there just wasn't enough character development for me to really immerse myself or to care about the characters in any particular way. And I just wasn't interested in all the minutia of running a bookshop and running book clubs. Maybe just because I have my own book clubs, it wasn't particularly interesting to me to read about how someone else runs their book club. Times where she's talking about what she's posting on social media and then lists out all the hashtags on every post, which is just something I don't care to read. Again, maybe because I have to post things on social media and use hashtags for a living. Maybe I'm just bored with that. I don't know. But sadly, this just didn't really connect for me. It didn't really land. I didn't find it particularly heartwarming or cozy or inspiring or motivating or calming or anything. It was just it exists, it was there. I have a feeling that I'm going to forget literally everything about this book within a couple weeks, probably. Because it just made no impression on me. So that is this book. I'm giving it 2 stars. Not my cup of tea, personally. Next up is Never Whistle at Night, which is a dark Indigenous fiction anthology. I would classify it as horror stories, and it's probably one of the longest anthologies of short stories that I have ever read. It just has many stories in it, so it's actually quite a long book. And this was our buddy read pick for the final quarter of 2024. And again, because our discussion was happening in January, I started it in 2024, but I ended up saving the last many stories to read in January, so they would be fresher in my mind for our discussion. And I really liked this. I have said many times before, and I'm sure I'll say many times again, that I struggle a bit with rating anthologies or short story collections because typically I love some of the stories, could leave some of the other stories. Sometimes I hate a story or two. There are usually quite a few stories that are fine, but don't necessarily move me one way or the other. And this was a similar experience for me, I would say. It definitely had stories that I absolutely loved. It had stories that I thought were just fine. Had a couple stories that I remembered very little about basically as soon as I finished them because they just didn't make an impression on me. I wouldn't say I hated any of the stories, so that's definitely good, but I am definitely a fan of horror as a genre. I'm also a fan of Indigenous horror. I just think there is something really visceral about the Indigenous horror that I have read personally, and it's not only relying on a lot of the horror elements that scare me the most, which is the horror of real people and how terrifying human beings can be and how badly we can treat each other. So many of these stories were really focused on human-based, reality-based horror. But there's also an element of the speculative in a lot of Indigenous horror that I've read that adds a really interesting element of the spirit world or of monstrous personifications of evil. And I find that I really enjoy that combination of most of the horror being based in reality and real human cruelty and evil, but having a little bit of sort of a looming presence of some sort of ancestral or otherworldly evil or power that adds an extra sense of danger and stakes to the situations. And these stories are exploring themes of colonization and genocide, generational trauma, child abuse, cultural identity, memory, objectification, racism, tokenism, assimilation, and more. I think horror is a really interesting way to explore a lot of these themes. I've been reading more books lately that have been using, for example, the haunted house as a way to explore colonization. And there was a story in this book that used the haunted house form as a way to explore colonization and gentrification that was really interesting. But there's also things like body horror or possession stories. Both can be used to explore things like, a lack of bodily autonomy, colonization, forced assimilation, and abuse and assault in a variety of ways. And I really loved so many of the stories. I think my absolute favorite stories were Heart-Shaped Clock and Before I Go. Those are the two that really stayed with me the most and made me cry. And the stories that I personally found scariest were Limbs, Human-Based Evil, Quantum, TikTok, Sundays, and Navajos Don't Wear Elk Teeth. So I would recommend this collection if you enjoy horror or if you're wanting to get into horror. I also was very pleasantly surprised. I was doing a mixed media read of this, both with the ebook and the audiobook, and a friend of mine, Sheldon, who I did a show with years ago, was one of the narrators. So I got to listen to a friend of mine narrate a bunch of these stories, and he's a great actor, he has a great voice, and it made it even better, and I got excited every time a story started, and he started talking and I recognized his voice. So that was fun. And I just really liked the experience of reading this. I thought it was really great. It's very incisive. It's very emotional at times. It's even wholesome and inspiring at times. There are stories that are absolutely devastating and heartbreaking. And there are stories that are sort of reveling in the silliness that can come along with horror and all kinds of things. And I just really enjoyed this collection. So I would recommend it. 4 stars for Never Whistle at Night. At this point, I started reading books for my Goodreads Choice Awards winners video that I make every year. But before I start getting into those, I did have one DNF this month, so I'm going to talk about it here. My one DNF was Under Lock and Key by Lana Ferguson, and this was an influencer copy I got from Libro FM. They give me free audiobooks every month because I am a creator in exchange for me sharing about their service. And Libro FM is my favorite way to listen to audiobooks, so I'm always happy to share the word. I love that I can get audiobooks and support local bookstores at the same time. You can choose what local indie bookshop you want to support with your audiobook purchases, and I chose one in Edmonton. And one of the options was Under Lock and Key, and I saw the Loch Ness Monster on the front. I am Scottish in my background. My family moved from Scotland to Canada way back when, and I have been to Scotland. I have been on Loch Ness. I thought for sure I saw the Loch Ness Monster when we were on Loch Ness. I kind of went through a phase where I was really obsessed with Nessie as a kid. So when I saw that this was a story where one of the love interests is essentially Nessie with a human form, I thought that sounded absolutely ridiculous and hilarious, and also I really wanted to read it. And unfortunately, there is a combination here of not liking the writing. The male love interest is described as being this huge hulking man, and the sort of huge size and height gap trope is not something that appeals to me. But also, I just found the writing pretty poor for my own personal taste. The female protagonist is 5'10", which is how tall I am, and in my experience, being 5'10", there are very few men who tower over me that I have met in my life. And of course, she couldn't have a love interest who is a similar height to her, even, let alone it would be shocking and appalling if, they happen to be shorter than her. Oh no, he has to tower over her. And then there's a point being made that he likes that he towers over her because he feels like it gets under her skin, which has unsettling implications in my opinion. I just wasn't necessarily getting along with it. I was starting to feel like maybe this was a big mistake and that I wasn't going to enjoy it. I then heard through the grapevine that there was a spicy scene in which the Nessie character transformed out of their human form during marrying the sex, which was not what I thought I was getting into. I'm not personally interested in monster smut, so that was a turnoff for me personally and not really something I wanted to read. I didn't expect that to come up. Maybe that's naive, maybe I should have, but it was not clearly indicated anywhere. And then I was informed by some of my friends on Goodreads that this author has been in some controversy in the past for racism in her fanfics. And I'm not in the fanfic world. I have maybe read 2 fanfics in my life about Firefly, if you know, you know. But otherwise, you know, I'm not in the fanfic world. I had never heard of this author before. I don't know anything about the Raylo fanfiction community. So I ended up deciding to DNF for all those reasons. If you know of books that have Nessie involved in some way that doesn't involve sex with Nessie in monster form, please let me know, because I feel like starting to read this reminded me of how obsessed I was with Nessie as a kid, and I kind of want to read something with Nessie, even if it's just characters who are, you know, trying to explore the mysteries of Loch Ness or something. So leave your suggestions down below. But this one was my one and only DNF for January. Okay, so now getting into the books that I have been reading for the Goodreads Choice Awards video. I'm gonna go through these much faster because I'm gonna make a whole video about all the winners of the Goodreads Choice Awards that I'm reading, and I'll go more into detail. So I'll just very quickly go through these because that video is gonna come out in a couple weeks, so you don't have long to wait. So first I read Funny Story by Emily Henry, and I have had such highs and lows with Emily Henry over the years, and I was starting to worry that Book Lovers was just a fluke, and I just happened to like that one, but that the rest of her books wouldn't be for me. But I was so pleasantly surprised by Funny Story. I would say that this is my favorite Emily Henry I've read. I still didn't give it 5 stars. There were still aspects of it that didn't quite work for me, little things here and there that bugged me. But overall, I really loved this, and I think part of it was that the main male love interest reminded me of my husband so much, and I know that that's, you know, highly specific to me, but not only some of the ways that he was described physically, some of his physical appearance, you know, having darker eyes and hair and having tattoos and having a bit of a disheveled appearance at times, or having, you know, a bit of a beard, or having a bit of a bad boy image, or people sort of view them as being more edgy, but really they are like the kindest, sweetest person with the biggest heart of gold, so gentle and funny and sweet and thoughtful. And that's my husband to a T. So as he started to get more introduced, I just thought, this man is amazing. I love him so much. Again, biased because he reminds me of my husband of a decade. But I just thought the premise of this was kind of fun and silly. I really enjoyed their relationship development. I really liked both characters a lot. And I thought that the slow build of their relationship was really genuine and sweet and heartwarming. And I just had a really good time reading this. I was totally swept up in their romance. I really thought it was just lovely. Honestly, the biggest drawback for me, and the main reason it wasn't 5 stars, is that I found the spicy scenes pretty awkward and cringy. I know that I'm not someone who necessarily seeks out books with sex scenes generally, but I just feel like it's a very fine line for me between what I will enjoy or at least find, you know, inoffensive in a sex scene, and when things transition over to being very uncomfortable and very cringy to me. And there was a lot of repetitive word choices that were very glaring to me. Things like people constantly padding everywhere. There were also so many mentions of the trapezius for some reason, which always stood out as odd because it would be during a sex scene, for example, and everything else would be referred to by their common or colloquial names, but then the trapezius would be the only thing that used the scientific name. I just kept wondering why Emily Henry was so hung up on the trapezius. Anyway, that was Funny Story. I really liked it. Not perfect, but probably my favorite Emily Henry I've read, and I gave it 4 stars. Would recommend. Then, unfortunately, I had a much less positive experience with How to End a Love Story by Yulin Kwang. This one in the debut novel category, I believe. I'm not gonna let myself rant right now because I will go on for way too long. I'll talk about this more in detail in my Goodreads Choice Awards winners video, but the premise of this is ridiculous. I hate it so much. I am not interested in a relationship between people who have this in common, the thing that connects them, and everything about it was cringy to me. I hated both main characters. Their dialogue was atrociously uncomfortable, and the sex scenes were so unsexy, it's ridiculous. Like, I've never been more dry. The characterization was very flat. They did not really have personalities. Their interests were not clear. Why they liked each other wasn't clear. I didn't understand how they got from where they started to where they started sleeping together, and then to the emotional connection. Didn't work for me, didn't like it, didn't have a good time, didn't like how it handled the subject matter of suicide. which was a big theme in this book. Thought it was pretty insensitive and pretty flippantly handled in a way that I found pretty gross, and I just didn't like this at all. So I'll save my rant for the Goodreads winners video, but just know I hated this. 1 star from me, would not recommend. Then I read the winner of the memoir category, which was the 3rd Gilmore Girl by Kelly Bishop, who played Emily Gilmore in Gilmore Girls. I watched Gilmore Girls as a kid, so I was interested in this. Again, I'll try not to go into too much detail because I'll talk about it again in my Goodreads video, but I loved figuring out and learning, because I didn't realize this, that Kelly Bishop was the original Sheila in A Chorus Line on Broadway. I was obsessed with A Chorus Line as a kid. It's not even funny how many times I listened to the original cast recording on vinyl in my living room and danced and sang every single song. I knew every part. I learned as much of the choreography as I could. I did not realize that she was the original Sheila and that Sheila's story, her character, was based on Kelly Bishop's life. All of her early story of starting to dance, of taking ballet classes, of moving to New York and becoming a chorus dancer, and eventually making her big break into more featured and acting and singing roles, and all her time in theater, that was my favorite part of this book. I did also find her transition to film and TV interesting, and it was nice to hear her reminiscing about Gilmore Girls, but my favorite part was the theater part and realizing she is a total icon and played the original Sheila. It's also mind-boggling that at the ballet, the iconic song, one of my favorites from A Chorus Line, is based on her actual life. I also enjoyed that she was unequivocally in support of abortion rights, of bodily autonomy, and talked about her experience of having an abortion. I think it's great. I think we should keep talking about it. It's a scary time to have a uterus, so I really appreciate when people are open about their experiences. I'll talk about it more in my Goodreads video, but I gave it 4 stars. Next up, I finished a book that I started, I think back in November, end of October of 2024, and it took me all the way to January to finish this book because I had to keep taking breaks. That was Model Home by Rivers Solomon. I'm a big fan of Rivers Solomon. I really enjoy their writing. They have written some of my favorite books like Sorrowland and An Unkindness of Ghosts. This is the first horror book I've read from them specifically. All the past books I've read from them have more of a speculative spin to them where they have fantasy or sci-fi leanings. This one was in a more contemporary setting, but was a haunted house, essentially. And this was a really tough read. I thought it was really fantastic. I was really moved by it emotionally. I felt very distraught reading a lot of it. It's quite upsetting. It explores some really dark themes. It is very raw in a way that I've come to expect from Rivers Solomon, and it's something I really appreciate in the writing, but it can make it really hard to read because no punches are pulled. And I definitely felt that reading this. Like I said, it took me a long time to read it. I had to take a lot of breaks, but I ended up being really glad that I picked it up. And it's not my favorite of Rivers Solomon's work, but definitely worth a read in my opinion, especially if you're a fan of literary horror, if you're a fan of, like I was saying earlier, haunted house as metaphor. The main character was so flawed and complex. Again, that's something I've really come to expect from Rivers Solomon. The characters that they write are so real feeling. They are very complicated and they have all those flaws and they have their traumas and they have their wounds and they have complicated relationships and they're just so compelling for that reason. And I definitely felt that with this main character. There's a lot of queer rep in this book. There's a lot of discussion and exploration of what it means to be family and complicated familial relationships, belonging, cycles of abuse, gender exploration, trauma, shame, racism, fear and grief, eerie, at times sort of hazy and dreamlike, and very intense, but in a contemplative kind of way. It's intense in its emotion, and the pacing is actually quite slow, but it feels quite driving at the same time. The reason why this wasn't a 5-star read for me personally was mostly the ending. I think the ending is probably realistic, but I found it pretty upsetting and it made me pretty angry, and I did have some sort of mixed rage feelings about the way it was resolved. I just really wanted something different, and again, it's probably realistic and I'm sure that that was intentional, but it just made me feel really angry and felt kind of unresolved. I also felt that veganism was treated really weirdly in this book. I think I've mentioned before in a video at some point that I have noticed more and more mentions of veganism in the books I'm reading, just random books that will bring it up. And this book had the protagonist's child who was vegan, but they were sort of more like a flexitarian. They would eat vegan sometimes and not other times, but their veganism came up repeatedly, and there were some pretty long sort of philosophical discussions or arguments or conversations about their veganism, and I just felt like the way it was explored fell short for me personally. From my perspective, as a vegan of over a decade, I just felt it wasn't explored with the same nuance and clarity that I usually expect from River Solomon. I was kind of disappointed in how it was portrayed, and it felt kind of odd to me, especially considering some of the other themes in the book. So that was also a drawback. I wouldn't have personally dropped a star for that because I am pretty used to non-vegans having takes on veganism that I don't agree with. That's just the world that we live in. I'm very used to it, don't worry. The ending, again, as much as it probably is realistic and makes sense, made me really mad, and it was upsetting, and I was not happy that it ended that way, and it made it really hard for me to give it 5 stars because I just felt so conflicted and angry at the end, which maybe means that it was a really good book and that you're supposed to feel angry and upset and conflicted if something like this were to happen in real life, and this result, which is common, were to happen, and that's fair. But yeah, I really struggled with it. So I'm trying to keep this spoiler free. Actually, let me know in the comments. I enjoy watching wrap-up videos. I haven't made them for a hot minute, but I enjoy watching them. And I don't think any of them that I watch anyway ever include spoilers for any of the books. And I typically include spoiler sections in my reading vlogs when I'm reviewing books, but I am not including them here. So I'm trying not to give any spoilers, and I'm kind of being more vague. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. Would you prefer that I do spoiler sections? Do you want me to talk about the endings of these books in the wrap-ups? The only thing that makes me hesitate, other than the fact that it doesn't seem to be very common, although I guess spoiler sections in general are not that common from the creators I watch, and I do like giving spoilers clearly marked and warning people so they can skip them if they want, but it would just make my wrap-ups even longer than they're already gonna be, and I can talk a lot, and I'm trying to be concise, so that would be my main hang-up. But let me know what you think in the comments. Do you want me to include spoilers in the future? It's a possibility. Anyway, I gave Model Home by River Solomon 4 stars. Then I read The Women by Kristen Hanna. This was the winner in the historical fiction category, and it focuses on our protagonist Frankie, who enlists in the army as a nurse and is shipped over to Vietnam and does 2 tours of duty before she returns home to the US. And when she comes back, opinions on Vietnam have changed pretty wildly, and she is struggling with the trauma of her experiences and not getting the support she needs. It explores her experience both in Vietnam and then on her return and dealing with that trauma and lack of support. And I think the idea was meant to be to focus on the experiences of women, of nurses in Vietnam, who are often maybe not the focus of stories about the Vietnam War. Again, I'm going to try to be concise because I will talk about this more in the Goodreads Choice video, but I did not like this. I think the best part of the book was the part that took place in Vietnam. For me personally, it felt like it was the best written, it had the best pacing, and it felt the most sincere. Although I have seen reviews that have said that it was not very specific or accurate in the way that it described Vietnam, which is disappointing. But most of the book happens after Frankie comes home, and I just found that part to be a slog. I think it was trying to explore some important things, especially PTSD. I just don't think it was done very well. And the biggest drawback for me about this book in general, as someone who did not live through the Vietnam War and is not American, I know almost nothing about the Vietnam War. We didn't learn about it in school, so my knowledge of the Vietnam War is cobbled together from mentions here or there in media, but I really know little to nothing about this war, and I felt like this book told me absolutely nothing about it. So much of this book is Frankie struggling with how angry people are about Vietnam and feeling like her service is being ignored, both because she was a woman and a nurse, but also because people have turned against the Vietnam War and don't think that the US should be there. And she's struggling with that so much, but we never actually learn why people are angry about the Vietnam War. And me reading it, I did not know the reasons why. I mean, I could guess from my knowledge of the world, but I didn't know specifically about the situation, how this came to be, all the political machinations that went into this war starting and why it went on for so long and how the public opinion shifted. And when I finished reading it, I ended up texting my dad to ask him because he lived through the Vietnam War in Canada, but he was of age and he would have probably had to go to fight if we were American. And he shared a bunch of information he remembered from the time, from the buildup and the political context and, you know, sort of the global context around communism and where the concern was coming from. from, and, you know, different leaders, different presidents and their takes on it, and how the public perception was shifting, et cetera, et cetera. And I learned so much more from a text exchange with my dad than I did from this entire book, and that is disappointing for me. I feel like historical fiction should teach you something, and I felt like I learned little to nothing from this book. I also found Frankie absolutely insufferable as a character. She was really hard to care about. I still had sympathy for her, empathy for her situation and struggling with PTSD, but she was so privileged and self-centered and constantly put other people in danger with her actions in a way that was really hard to witness. And it also ended up turning into a little bit of a melodrama romance with multiple suitors and multiple, you know, shocking twists in her relationships, and it got really melodramatic at the end there. So this one was just no. This is a no from me. 1 star for the women. No, thank you. The last thing I read for the Goodreads Choice Awards in January was The Wedding People, which was the winner of the general fiction category. This is another book, similar to How to End a Love Story, that treats suicide very flippantly and in a way that I really did not appreciate. And that was my biggest gripe with this book. The way it handles the issue of suicidality and suicide in general was really upsetting to me. It felt very callous and in extremely poor taste. And I just really didn't like this book at all. Really hated it, really hated the main character, thought the setup was kind of stupid, didn't like any of the other characters, and the writing style was just not for me at all. On top of all that, it mentioned COVID or the pandemic or lockdown so many times. I feel like every other sentence was talking about during COVID, back during lockdown, before the pandemic, over and over and over and over again. I really didn't like this book at all. I don't know what it brings to the table. I don't know why people like it, but it did not work for me at all. I will unleash my ranting for the Goodreads Choice video, but just know I do not recommend this book whatsoever. Hated it. 1 star from me. And then the final 3 books I read for January are all in my last reading vlog, my 48-hour reading vlog. So again, I'll try to be a little bit more brief and concise because you can watch that video and see me reading it and giving much more thorough, in-depth reviews, including spoiler sections. But the last 3 books I read in January were The Old Man Who Read Love Stories by Louise Sepulveda, Walking Practice by Do Ki Min, and Fruit of the Dead by Rachel Leon. The Old Man Who Read Love Stories is a Latin American classic from the 80s. The author is from Chile. But the story is set in the Ecuadorian rainforest, and it's really a parable and a exploration of colonization and the negative impacts on the environment and on the local people when colonists or settlers arrive and don't respect the natural order, the natural balance of nature. And in this book, essentially, we get nature fighting back. And I really enjoyed this. It was quite simple in the writing style. It's quite straightforward, but it has some really lovely sort of poetic moments. The main character, who is the old man who reads love stories, was quite endearing to me and a very interesting character. And I thought, despite this being quite short, it did a really good job of exploring the themes, and it was very immersive and the setting was very vivid, and I really liked it. So I gave The Old Man Who Read Love Stories 4 stars. Then we have Walking Practice by Do Ki Min. This is literary horror, and we're following an alien who is stranded on Earth and having to survive, and they fulfill their needs by sleeping with and then murdering and eating humans. And this is really a metaphor for the dehumanization that comes with queerness, and also less officially, but to me came across very strongly as an exploration of similarly the dehumanization or invisibility of many forms of chronic illness, chronic pain, or disability. And I thought the premise here was a really great vehicle to explore these ideas, this dehumanization that comes with otherness, whether the otherness is queerness or disability or chronic illness or pain. There is just something very raw and vulnerable and incisive about this. The writing style is really unique and sort of experimental in a way that makes the alien protagonist feel more alien, which is really fun. I also found the main character alien, as flawed as they are, to be quite endearing. The biggest drawback for me with this was that there was quite a bit of fat phobia. I'll also highlight that for The Old Man Who Read Love Stories, this also has more fat phobia than I would personally prefer, which is none. But this one has even more blatant fat phobia, so just be aware. And as always with all these books, check out the content warnings on the book cards to kind of know what you're getting yourself into. This one also has explicit violence and sex. I thought it did a really great job of exploring the themes it was going for, but I did feel that the fat phobia was a bit counterproductive. So I ended up giving Walking Practice 4 stars. I think this could be very validating for many people to read, but just be aware going into it that the fat phobia is quite jarring and upsetting. And now we've made it to the final book I finished in January, which was Fruit of the Dead by Rachel Lyon. This was a big disappointment for me. This is a contemporary retelling of Persephone and Demeter, and Hades is also there, but he's more of a third wheel in this version. I just felt, as beautiful as the writing is here, and it is absolutely gorgeous, the characters are so empty and flat. They have very little personality. They are very unlikable and all make terrible and very dumb decisions repeatedly. I didn't really believe in them as characters and as real people, but also in their relationships. I wasn't rooting for them. I wasn't particularly invested in their future. It just fell flat for me on the emotional side of it. And because this is really meant to explore the mother-daughter connection, that Demeter-Persephone connection, the fact that the characters felt so flat and their relationships felt so one-dimensional really made it very difficult for me to actually care about them and be invested in the exploration of their relationship. And the mother in particular was not my favorite person. I go into much more detail in my reading vlog, especially in the spoiler section, so go check that out if you want more details. But this just fell really flat for me, which is really unfortunate because the writing is absolutely beautiful. I will definitely check out this author's debut novel in the hopes that the writing is just as gorgeous, but the characters have a little bit more substance to them, because this was a very disappointing missed opportunity of a read, in my opinion. Those are the 12 books I finished in January and my one DNF. I hope you enjoyed this wrap up. Let me know your thoughts on any of these books that you've read in the comments. I would love to chat about them with you a little bit more. Check out my reading vlog if you want much more detailed reviews of those last 3 books, and make sure to stay tuned for my Goodreads Choice Awards video that will be coming in a week or two, because I will go into even more detail into all of the winners that I was reading, as well as the rest of the winners that I am reading in February. And let me know in general what you want to see from me for wrap-ups. Do you want me to go into more detail and share spoilers or not? And also thoughts on stats. My initial plan or thought was to save stats for my reading journal video, since I do a stats page for each month. So I was thinking I might save the stats for that video. But let me know your thoughts in the comments, what you want to see, since I am getting back into doing wrap-ups after a few years, and I am open to suggestions on how I handle them. But that's it. It's very cold. I turned off the heat so that the heat wouldn't make noise while I was recording, but the house is getting very cold. So I'm gonna end this and turn the heat back on because it's winter in Canada. I hope you enjoyed this. Give it a like if you did, and subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on the notification bell if you want to be notified when I post my Goodreads Choice Awards winners of 2024 video, because that one's a fan favorite every year. But with that, I'm gonna get going. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.